Okay, well, I think it's about that time to begin. We already have a sizable crowd and it's still increasing here, so I'll give everyone a few seconds to continue dropping in. My name is Daniel Reeves. I serve as the Education and Outreach Director for the Center for Science and Culture here at Discovery Institute. And I'm pleased to introduce another webinar in this series of book launch webinars that we've been hosting for a couple of years now. So this one is on animal algorithms. And I'll be introducing our two guests today, Casey Luskin and Eric Cassel, here in a second. First of all, I just wanted to mention a couple of kind of mechanics for how these things work if you haven't joined one of our book launch webinars before. The first thing is that we'll be having a brief introduction and conversation about the book. And during that time, it'd be great for you to go ahead and open up your Q&A box that you'll see at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And just to get started, to get comfortable using that, feel free to drop in either your location where you're joining from or your name, just as a way of testing it out to see how that works. It's always nice to see where people are joining from around the world, around the country. And then as soon as we start our conversation about the book, feel free to start submitting your questions for the author, and we'll be kind of filtering through those and pitching them towards the end of the call today. The call will be about an hour long, so we've got well over 100 people on the call already, and there'll be plenty of questions. So we apologize in advance if we don't get to all of those questions today. But let's see. So that's about all you need to know as far as the mechanics of this. At the end, we'll mention again where you can find the book online and a little bit about how to help us promote this book. But without further ado, I'll hand things over to Casey. Casey needs very little introduction. I think most people that get our emails or subscribe to our events are familiar with Casey. He's been involved since the inception of the intelligent design conversation, really, and is involved in many different areas of research and conversation around intelligent design. I could say many things about him. I'd say the most recent thing is that he just returned to the US from his studies in geology, completing a PhD at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. So we are very pleased to have him back here at the office in Seattle. And he's managing all sorts of research programs and other things like that. So welcome, Casey, and I'll hand things over to you.
Thank you so much, Daniel. It's really a pleasure to be with you all today. I've been looking forward to this for quite some time. This is the Animal Algorithms webinar with author Eric Cassel. It's really a pleasure to be able to interview Eric for this webinar today. And so first I'd like to introduce him for our participants. So Eric Cassel is an expert in navigation systems, including GPS, and has a long time interest in animal navigation. He has more than 4 decades of experience in systems engineering related to aircraft navigation and safety. He served as an engineering consultant for NASA and the FAA, or Federal Aviation Administration, and he has developed computer algorithms for safety systems and has published over 30 technical papers and numerous technical reports. His academic training includes bachelor's degrees in biology and electrical engineering, biology from George Mason University and electrical engineering from Villanova University, as well as a master's in science and religion from Biola University. And that, of course, included the history and philosophy of science. And he has had a long-term interest in studying various aspects of animal behavior. So Eric, I just want to say off the bat that your book was such a delight to sort of edit and read through as you were going through the publication process. And in his endorsement of your book, paleontologist Gunter Beckley says that it fills an important gap in the ID literature. And I just want to say I fully agree with that statement, because no one, I think, had fully attempted to tackle, no one has ever fully attempted yet, but no one has even really given an attempt to tackle animal behavior in such a manner. And the work that you've done here is so important. It's really a natural extension of where ID thinking needs to go. And I'm very excited about seeing ID breaking into this new field of animal behavior. So surprisingly, I didn't fully appreciate the title of your book, Animal Algorithms, until yesterday when I was rereading the book in an airport. And I appreciated, okay, we're talking about literally programming in animal brains. I mean, you define an algorithm as a formal procedure for any mathematical operation, especially a set of well-defined rules for solving a problem in a finite number of steps. And what you're saying is that animals are literally programmed with algorithms, hard-coded, presumably into their brains, to allow them to perform complex calculations that afford all kinds of behaviors vital for their survival. And you said in your book that those who program computer algorithms for a living are especially well situated to appreciate how complex an animal or an algorithm needs to be to function. And I don't program computers for a living, but I did write something like 30,000 lines of Python code during my PhD. I know that some people won't consider Python real computer programming, but suffice to say, algorithms are complicated. And they really are a set of ordered instructions. If you get one thing wrong, they don't work. So I want to learn more in this conversation about why you think animal behaviors are like algorithms and what you think the implications are for the ability of these behaviors to evolve by Darwinian evolution. So my first question for you is, what got you started on this animal algorithms book project?
Thanks, Casey. Thanks for having me on the webinar. I appreciate it. Yeah, so the beginning of it goes back quite a ways, actually. I only started actually writing the book a few years ago, relatively few. But the origins of it go back a lot farther when I was working on aircraft navigation systems, and then just happened to be reading several articles about animal migration and navigation, and was amazed at the ability of animals to navigate so accurately and repeatedly. And that really caught my attention. And it was also about the same time frame that I was studying biology in an undergraduate program. And when I sort of put two things together in terms of, okay, this is a pretty sophisticated ability that animals have, and then started asking questions about how did such an ability even evolve in the first place, and how do you explain how they're actually implemented? So that's kind of the origin of it. And as time went on, I started looking at other kinds of animal behaviors and was finding the same kinds of similar kinds of behaviors that are complex and, to me, difficult to explain from a Darwinian evolutionary point of view.
That's great. And of course, you mentioned in your book that you had a career as an engineer working on aircraft navigation systems. And I assume the answer is yes, it did, but maybe you could elaborate. I mean, how do you think that this field of work that you were doing prepared you to study topics like animal navigation and migration? And how do the systems that animals use for navigation stack up against our own human technology, like what we use in airplanes and other technologies?
Right. Yeah, good question. So a couple of things. One, we already mentioned that there's definitely algorithms involved, but from a bigger perspective, when you talk about sophisticated navigation systems like those that are used by modern aircraft, these are highly engineered systems. Typically, commercial aircraft have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lines of code in the navigation and flight control systems. So they're highly complex. And there's a number of aspects of the engineering that's involved when you build systems like that. One is they're highly integrated. So you have to match up not just the software, but the hardware, the sensors, the flight control system, et cetera. And then all of this has to be done in a coherent manner. So there's a number of fundamental engineering principles that are involved whenever you develop a system such as this. And it turns out, surprisingly, not just to biologists, but to those of us that are engineers as well, when you start examining some of these systems in animals, they exhibit the same kind of principles that we use in developing man-made navigation systems. And my favorite example is actually in a desert ant that resides in, as the name implies, in deserts in Africa. And these ants actually employ several different types of navigation sensors. They use a sun compass, a polarized light compass. They have an odometer. They do chemotaxis, in other words, with sensing chemicals. And then they use all that information in an integrated manner, and they actually do what biologists call path integration, what us engineers would typically call inertial navigation, basically the same thing, where they integrate all this information and then are able to not only navigate accurately to where they want to go, but one of the unique things about it is whenever they go on, for example, a foraging excursion from their home nest, they can go on a very circuitous path away from the nest, turning a number of times, different directions. But then when they go to return home, they are able to actually compute a direct path from wherever they are back to their home nest. And again, it's based on this inertial navigation type of system. So it's very surprising that such a system exists in an ant.
That's absolutely incredible, Eric. I mean, you say that they use what we use, but it might be more like we use the kind of systems that they use. I mean, the sophistication here is just incredible. You're talking about path integration. This brings me back a little bit of like anxiety and maybe like some PhD TSD, as I like to say, of being out in the field doing my field work during my geology degree in South Africa. And you would go and you'd wander off looking for rocks, and you would totally go off the path, not knowing where you are. And then you got to find your way back to the car. But ants are able to do these calculations automatically. I mean, things that we human beings struggle to do, and they're just programmed to do it. I just find that absolutely incredible.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing about this is that, as you imply, we are just now catching up technology-wise with what many animals have been doing for thousands or millions of years. You know, our human ability to navigate long distances didn't really become a reality until sometime in the 1700s with the development of accurate clocks that could be used on ships. Prior to that, ships had a lot of trouble navigating very long distances because they couldn't determine longitude in an accurate way. And there's a famous example, I think, that I cite in the book about a fleet of British ships that got lost, ran aground, and the ships sank because they were lost and didn't have accurate navigation information. So that launched a big project by the British Navy to try to develop a better system. But so there was that period of time, and then it really wasn't until the 20th century that with the development of aircraft that we developed much better navigation systems. And it's taken a long time to get there. And finally with GPS, we have a system that actually finally starts to mimic what many animals have been doing for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, you talk in your book about examples of jets landing at the wrong airports. And you would think that would never happen in our modern day of technology, but yet it is so vital to have accurate navigation information. And I think we'll get into this more, Eric, in the conversation, but I think that this is actually a really good analogy to the way Darwinian evolution works. Because if you're flying an airplane, my dad was a pilot. I've flown with my dad many times over the years, and I've actually been in a plane when it lost power, and it's a pretty scary experience, let me tell you. But you know, you've got to get everything right in a plane or it falls out of the sky. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, but it's just like Darwinian evolution, because if you have, you know, the whole system working, but one component fails in an organism, then it dies. And if it dies, it doesn't pass on its genes to the next generation, and it's an evolutionary dead end. So I think that the analogy to piloting a plane or navigating, you know, where you've got to get everything right or you fall out of the sky and die is a lot like Darwinian evolution, but we'll come more to that later. So obviously your book is titled Animal Algorithms, and I want to know exactly what you mean when you say that animal behaviors are like an algorithm. And in fact, you in your book distinguish animal behaviors that are programmed from those that are learned, like say many primate behaviors. And you say at the very beginning, you're not talking about these learned behaviors. You're talking about programmed behaviors. And in your book, you want to say you only want to study those behaviors that are programmed. So what is an algorithm, and what do you mean when you say that these behaviors are programmed, and what makes them like an algorithm?
So first of all, yeah, they're programmed in the sense that they're innate, and most of these animals can actually perform these behaviors the moment they're born. And so they don't require development. Now, some animals and some behaviors, they do refine the behavior over time. That goes on. So there's a little bit of a learning process there, but the basic behavior is there. the moment they're born. So that they're innate and not learned. And then the algorithm part of it, there's actually a number of different aspects of this. Like you mentioned earlier, typically when we think of an algorithm, it's more of a mathematical algorithm. And that is the case for many of these behaviors, particularly the ones involving navigation, where the animal is actually computing a path. So that involves trigonometry or some other form of mathematics. But other types of algorithms that are involved here are more along the lines of decision making. So for example, in the social insects that are discussed, these insects actually are programmed to make decisions about the behavior that they're going to perform. In other words, are they going to forage? Are they going to take care of the queen or take care of the other animals, feed, things like that. So there's a lot of different behaviors that go on in social insect colonies. And the algorithms are actually a process where they sense the conditions that the colony is in, and then they make a decision about what is the optimum behavior to perform at any particular time. So that is a pretty sophisticated algorithm.
So along these lines, you define a key concept in your book that you talk about a lot called a complex programmed behavior, or a CPB. What do you mean by a complex programmed behavior?
So yeah, there's a number of aspects that go into what I was calling a complex programmed behavior. First of all, it's complex. It's not just simple in the sense of sometimes if you think of some reactions where you have a stimulus and a response, that's fairly simple. These behaviors are more complex than that. They're programmed, like we talked about. They're purposeful in the sense that they always have some goal. There's some particular goal in mind. And then again, the fact that they're heritable, they're not learned, they are innate. So they're presumably in the genome in some way. There is some epigenetics involved in some of these that we found, but for the most part, we think they have to be in the genome, although again, in many cases, we really don't know how they're actually coded in the genome.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And this was one of the most incredible things you talked about in your book, how these tiny brains of an ant, or you talk about the worm C. elegans, which has only, I think you said 302 neurons. So how can a mind that small be programmed, and not just programmed with behaviors, but you talk about how these small brains are programmed to learn new behaviors and also then to have a memory so it can remember what it learned. How can a brain that small have such sophistication?
Well, that's kind of the big question, and it doesn't just apply to the C. elegans in that example, but it applies to many other animals as well. You have a tiny brain that actually is able to exhibit a number of different behaviors, and in this case, they've actually been able to map the entire brain. Because it's such a small number of neurons and they're relatively large, they do have the actual physical map. But we have no idea how the programming of the behavior actually goes on in the brain. And just to expand that analogy, the other kinds of insects that are discussed in the book, honeybees in particular and ants, they also have relatively small brains. Now, in their case, they're approximately 1 million neurons, which is still a really, really small brain compared to mammals, for example. But they also have really sophisticated behaviors. And so somehow or another, these behaviors are programmed into the neural networks that comprise their brains. And again, we really have no idea how that's done. There's been some research showing how some of the most simple behaviors might be encoded in a simple neural network, but that's kind of the extent of it. We really don't have any idea how these more sophisticated behaviors are programmed.
It's just incredible. So I want to say that, without trying to sound too much like an infomercial, your book really is fun to read. You showcase so many different examples of animal behavior that are absolutely incredible. I guarantee you someday somebody's got to make a documentary about what you talk about in this book, because there's so many examples that would just blow people's minds. So one of my favorite examples is the wasps who will build landmarks for themselves so they can find their way to their food stashes. That's very intelligent behavior, very rational behavior, to build some kind of a marker that you can recognize so you know where you stored your food. Or I think it's incredible, the Arctic tern that spends its summers in the Arctic and then migrates south to spend the summer again in the Antarctic. And it basically spends its whole life chasing the summer, going from north to south, never ending up in a hemisphere where it's not summer. But what really mystified me, and we already talked about this a little bit, is the idea of path integration, where animals keep track of their compass heading and distance traveled so they can fly directly home, but not necessarily along the path that they took. And you say that they can do this without necessarily following landmarks. And you talk about honeybees and their ability to navigate using the sun's angle at different times of day. So they can learn how to navigate using the sun's angle at different times of day to find their way home, regardless of what time it is. Or they can use polarized light by studying different regions of the sky to determine the position of the sun. And you say that doing this to be able to find their way home requires doing trigonometry, spherical geometry, and other complex math. And what they have a brain with 1 million neurons, and I have supposedly 100 billion neurons in my brain, and I don't think I can do those kinds of calculations in my brain. And I find this all incredible. So the fact that these kinds of features evolved really just makes me wonder, how did they arise, or how could they arise via an unguided, stepwise Darwinian process? I'd love to see a stepwise evolutionary explanation for this if it exists. And I'm wondering, are you aware of attempts to explain behaviors like this through a standard, typical Darwinian model?
The short answer is no. I have not come across anything in the literature about those kinds of behaviors and how they could have evolved. And I think it's such a daunting task to try to explain how something as sophisticated as an algorithm, particularly a mathematical type of algorithm, how that could have evolved in the first place. And then there's several elements of that, right? It has to be in the genome somehow. And then that information that's in the genome then has to be encoded in a neural network when the brain develops. And then it all has to be run as the animal is performing the behavior. So there's a lot of unanswered questions about how all that takes place.
Yeah, for those of you who have the book, figure 3.3 was really helpful for me. I know that means nothing to people who haven't drawn the book in front of them, but when you get the book, rewatch this and look at figure 3.3. It talks about the different components that are necessary for animal navigation and migration behavior to work. You've got to have navigation sensor physiology, a navigation algorithm. You got to have destination, location information, migration decision algorithm, and migratory physiology to implement all of this. And if you're missing one of those components, one of those elements, then it doesn't work. And those 5 separate groups of genes, and as you put it, other genetic information in the genome, they all have to be there in order for these navigation and migration algorithms to work. So let's talk about another example you give, the monarch butterfly, which in North America requires 3 generations, you say, for the migration to complete itself. And so that has to be genetically programmed, because obviously the butterflies that are maybe in the middle of that migration pathway, how could they have learned where they're going? They weren't even alive when the migration started. So how do they know where to go? They've never been to the destination. To me, that obviously implies, I'm sure you argue this in the book very persuasively, that the information had to be preloaded into those organisms when they're born. You call it preloaded software. So where do they get the preloaded software that tells them where to go? And how does this evolve by an unguided Darwinian process?
Again, that's a really difficult question that nobody has an answer for. There are some theories out there about how in some cases animals might have developed the behavior, basically learned the behavior. and then somehow that behavior gets transferred into the genome. How that happens, that's a good question. It's a theory that I've seen people propose, but I don't understand how it actually could even work in reality, because you have a behavior that somehow then gets transmitted into the gametes and in the genome. I don't even understand how that theoretically even works, but it's a serious proposal that a number of people believe in.
It sounds very Lamarckian almost. I mean, if we still lived in the days of Lamarck, maybe you could believe it could arise by an unguided evolutionary mechanism. And of course, there are new, they call them neo-Lamarkian mechanisms. So maybe there is some influence of, inheritance of acquired characteristics going on here. But as you said, it's yet to be demonstrated. So these sound very mysterious at the present time.
Right.
Yeah. You also mentioned, obviously that to navigate, animals and humans both use some of the same things. We both use landmarks. We both use the sun. We use magnetic compass. We use stars, chemicals, smells, temperature, gravity. So who is better at navigating, humans or animals? And I want to also, kind of throw into this, how has technology changed the way we humans navigate? We talked about this on the phone earlier today, how maybe 100 years ago, humans navigated, or say 2,000 years ago, humans navigated much differently than they do today. So how has technology changed the way we navigate?
Well, yeah, the first part of your question, fundamentally, animals are better navigators than humans. If you think about a human with no technology, we're very poor navigators. Yeah, we can use the sun because we can figure out, the sun rises east, sets in the west, etc. So we're able to use that information and landmarks. But other than that, humans are very poor natural navigators, whereas all of these animals are actually expert navigators. They're all designed to perform accurate navigation to suit their own purposes. In terms of technology, I think, as I mentioned before, it's only been within the last couple of 100 years that we've even developed any useful technology for navigation, and particularly in the 20th century, in the age of aircraft, that we did develop inertial navigation, radio navigation, and of course now GPS. So things have changed quite a bit in that sense. But again, we're basically just trying to catch up to what animals have been doing for a long time.
No, it's really, really incredible. And you mentioned navigating using the sun. I did not appreciate how important the sun is for human navigation till I moved to the Southern Hemisphere during my PhD. And obviously, if you live in the Northern Hemisphere, which is where I grew up, the sun is always in the south. But when I moved to South Africa, the sun is always in the north. And so I lived just north of the university. And there were literally a couple times where I would get in my car to drive home from school, and I would start driving in the opposite direction, south, because in my mind, I was orienting myself with the sun. I knew I was supposed to go north, and for me, going north meant you drive away from the sun. And so I was going I didn't even think about it. I did not even appreciate how much intuitively, as a human being, I used the sun to navigate until the sun was in the wrong place and I was going in the wrong direction. So it's really amazing how we do have some of these inbuilt things, but I mean, it doesn't hold a candle to what some of the navigation methods of what you're talking about that these invertebrates, these insects can do. It's just incredible. You also talk about spider webs in your book, and they're probably one of the most famous examples of an amazing animal behavior. So I want to ask you, Eric, how do spiders produce silk? And what do the theories say about how spiders know instinctively how to produce a web? And are there, again, same question, are there evolutionary explanations for the origin of spider webs? And if so, what do you think of them?
So on the question about silk, what's interesting about that, it's a very complex material that involves a lot of proteins, and it's a very complex process to produce the material. And humans have been trying to duplicate silk artificially for a long time, And basically, we've never been able to do it because it's so complex. We have some materials that sort of approximate the composition of silk, but never really duplicates it. So that's one thing there. And the process that the spiders use to generate it is a complex process also. The webs, there has been a lot of research in the web designs and how they possibly could have evolved over time. But there's issues there as well because, for example, there's species of spiders that are completely unrelated, but yet produce the same exact web design. So how do you explain that? The typical Darwinian explanation that it's convergent evolution, which is just one of these terms that doesn't really have a scientific basis, right? They just use that term to explain something that doesn't fit within typical Darwinian evolution. And it's just, selection pressure or, some other vague term like that is used. But really, the origin of the webs and then how spiders are able to manipulate them and actually as part of their behavior, the way that they use them is really a complex behavior that's pretty sophisticated.
Yeah, anybody who's seen a spider weaving its web, you have to marvel at that. Even if you believe that it evolved by unguided processes, I think that it's still an amazing thing to watch. So for those of us who are watching this and wondering, okay, so obviously, Eric, we've talked about a few examples of animal behaviors and how they lack evolutionary explanations. But are we ID people the only ones who actually feel this way, that these are a challenge to evolve? I want to note that you provide a really striking quote in your book from Jerry Fedor and Massimo Piatelli Palmerini from their book, What Darwin Got Wrong. And they're talking about animal behavior. And they say in this quote that, quote, such complex, sequential, rigidly pre-programmed behavior could have gone wrong in many ways at any one of its steps. Such cases of elaborate innate behavioral programs, and they say spider webs, bee foraging, as we saw above, and many more, cannot be accounted for by means of optimizing physico-chemical or geometric factors. And they go on to say that they can hardly be accounted for by gradualistic adaptation either. It's fair to acknowledge that although we bet some naturalistic explanation will one day be found, we have no such explanation at present. If we insist that natural selection is the only way to try, we will never have one. So, wow. I mean, these are two authors who describe themselves in their book as, quote unquote, outright card-carrying, signed up, dyed in the wool, no holds barred atheists. And yet they're saying that there is no Darwinian natural selection-based explanation, and they're really doubtful there ever will be for the origin of these complex behaviors. And you also talk about a textbook that says we still know little about the rate and type of evolutionary change experienced by behavioral traits. So, I mean, I guess just to hone in on this point, in all of your readings, have you ever found stepwise gradualistic Darwinian evolutionary explanations for the origin of these complex behaviors? Or is this true? I mean, is it really the case that they just don't exist in any detail in the literature?
So, in my research in the literature, for the most part, there isn't any. There is only one particular type of behavior that at least there's some theories that have been proposed, and that concerns the insect social behavior. So the basic theory behind that is there are insects, bees, ants, etc., that exhibit solitary behaviors. In other words, there's a difference between those that are social and those that are solitary. And so the theory is that when an animal transitions from a solitary lifestyle to a social lifestyle, it's just a matter of adding a few algorithms, if you will, a few steps to integrating that information into a social environment. Well, at first that sounds somewhat plausible, but the evidence really is not there that that's the case, because for two reasons. One is that the social behaviors that these animals exhibit far exceed the behaviors that solitary animals do. That's one thing. The other is the genomic information. Insect social behavior is one area. There has been quite a bit of research into the genomes of these animals. And what's been found is that the genomes of the social insects have undergone significant, and I'm using the word evolution loosely, but significant change when they transition from solitary to social. So there's literally hundreds and thousands of genetic changes that take place in these animals when they're social. So how that could have happened through a step-by-step, piecewise linear Darwinian fashion is not very plausible.
So, okay, so this will, I think, lead into my final question during our conversational part of the interview, and we'll go to questions from the audience in just a moment here. But I want to ask you, at the end of the day, it sounds like there's a lot of information that goes into the origin of these animal behaviors. So how does information important for the origin of these animal behaviors? And what is your view on what this implies for intelligent design?
Yeah, so, and we've been talking about, these are behaviors, for the most part, are all controlled by algorithms in one form or another. And to have an algorithm, you have to have information. Where does the information come from that even defines the algorithm in the first place? So that's the part that's challenging. A lot of the research that's been done by the ID community tends to indicate that you really can't generate information through basically a random process, which is mutations and natural selection. It's just incapable of doing that. And if you look at the work of Bill Dembski and some others regarding these theorems called no-free lunch theorems, that's basically what they say. It's difficult to explain the origin of this kind of information through a purely random process. And so I think that's one of the biggest hurdles to overcome in trying to explain the origin of these kinds of behaviors.
Okay, great. Well, let's transition then into some questions from our participants. We have a first question from Jim, who has asked, have there been any attempts to find the location of behavior algorithm in the DNA of a creature? So can they actually pinpoint, the gene or the place in the genome where these algorithms are encoded in your knowledge?
Not that I'm aware of. The only thing I will say is that there has been some research into some fairly simple behaviors where they can explain that there's basically, for example, a genetic switch. So there's a gene or maybe a couple of genes that control a switch that in turn controls a behavior. So but that's a very simple instantiation, and I wouldn't even call it an algorithm. It's just basically on or off kind of a change.
Yeah, so you mentioned that they had mapped the brain of C. elegans, and there's another question that asks, have any specific mutations in C. elegans been mapped or correlated with specific C. elegans behaviors? Are you aware of, have they been able to tease any of that apart?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any research into that.
Okay. What about pheromones? We have a question from Robert. Do animals use pheromones as a component of their navigation?
Yes. So pheromones, there's a couple of different ways that chemicals are used by these animals. One is for chemotaxis, so they will, some animals lay down a trail. For example, ants can lay down a trail with chemicals to follow. But pheromones are also very important in the social insects because what they'll do in the colonies is that they can sense the condition of the colony, various aspects of it, and based on the pheromones that are being output from other insects in the colony, and then in turn they use that information to change their own behavior. So pheromones are very important.
So we have a question from Pat. Can these neural networks be manipulated to deprogram a behavior? So for example, have you ever found a pointless behavior that has been, or has a novel, pointless behavior been programmed by manipulating neurons? So can we basically create new behaviors or remove behaviors through genetic engineering, I suppose?
I would assume the answer is probably yes, but I'm not aware of it, particular research into that one.
So here's an interesting question from James. He asks, are such things as goals, intentions, or complementary intuitions really accountable through genetic algorithms? And I think you talk about this a little bit in your book, Eric. Basically biologists talking about whether purpose is real or teleology is real in biology, and them not wanting to see teleology, and yet they're confronted with these behaviors that seem to be very, very goal-directed. I mean, even if they evolved, it's very goal-directed, where you have an Arctic tern that's flying from the Arctic to the Antarctic every year. That's very goal-oriented. It has to get to a certain destination. So I guess are these goals real, or are we just imagining that there are goals there?
Well, I think from a common sense point of view, they're real. To me, they're pretty obvious that, for example, navigation and migration, the goal in migration is fairly obvious. And then another example is the social behavior of insects. There's a higher level goal, right? You could actually think of it as different levels. So the higher level goal for a social colony is just for the colony to continue to exist. And in order to do that, there's a number of tasks that have to be performed by the insects in that colony. And those are all very purposeful and goal-oriented. But like you said, a lot of scientists have, for a long time now, have tried to avoid even talking about goals and teleology. I use the phrase teleophobia. I think a lot of these scientists are teleophobic about even talking about it.
That's a great word. I'm gonna borrow that word. I'll try to remember to give you credit for that, Eric. And I see this so much in the literature. You see papers actually being written saying, we cannot talk in biology about systems having goals. The goal of a bacterial flagellum is not to help a bacteria swim to find food, okay? There are no goals. It's all unguided. And it really kind of gives them cognitive dissonance trying to understand how these highly goal-directed behaviors and systems don't actually have any purpose. In fact, you make this great point, which I thought was really kind of cute. You said that it seems like the only instinct that exists there's one biologist or an evolutionary psychologist who said that human beings have this tendency to view the natural world and all of its wonders through the lens of its design, and that's hindered our understanding of biological complexity. And it seems like, I think you say that the only instinct that actually exists is the human instinct to mistakenly think that instincts are really designed for a purpose. And I just thought, wow, I mean, it's just absurd when you refuse to believe that there's any goal or purpose or design in biology. You really struggle to understand what's going on. Okay, well, we have a question from John talking about the Bartailed godwit. I don't know if you're familiar with this bird, that it was found to make a world record of flying 7,500 miles nonstop from Alaska to New Zealand, out of sight of land, flying day and night for about 8 days. Wow. Any comments? Are you familiar with this example, or anything you can share about this?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's an amazing feat of navigation that these birds are able to do this. And so I'll comment on two aspects of this. One is the fact that they can even sustain themselves for such a period of time, outputting so many calories it takes to fly. One of the things that these long distance migrants do is they basically build up their fat reserves for weeks prior to leaving on migration. So they have the energy reserves. The other thing, and you touched on this earlier about navigation, birds like that, many of them that do these long distance migrations, they're actually flying what we call great circle routes. For those who are not familiar with that, if you think of it, to me, a simple example is if you're going to fly from New York to Tokyo, they're roughly on the same latitude. So if you just looked at a flat map, you would say you just fly due west. Well, that's not the shortest route. When you look at it on a globe, you want to fly basically near over the North Pole. That's the shortest route from New York to Tokyo. Well, birds, many of these long-distance migrant birds are able to do the same thing. So they have some method that they're actually able to compute these great circle routes. And when we do it, you have to use spherical geometry. How they do it, we have no idea.
Amazing. I want to get back to something you mentioned earlier, Eric, about eusociality and these insects that have complex behaviors that seem designed to benefit the whole hive or population or group. And you also mentioned convergent evolution. So in one of your chapters, I think it might be chapter 5, you talk about how eusociality is found in a number of different insect groups, but they're not necessarily closely related to each other. They're not nested in sort of a nice, neat monophyletic group, these eusocial insects. And in chapter 6, you talk a lot about how animal traits show convergence. So I'm wondering, what in your mind is one of the most striking examples of convergence in animal behaviors that you have encountered in your studies? And do you see this sort of non-monophyletic distribution of eusociality and other complex behaviors? Do you see this as posing a challenge, not just to Darwinian evolution, but also to common ancestry?
Yeah, exactly. And I think the example you cited in some of these eusocial insects, again, they are the ones that exhibit these behaviors in these very large social colonies. Most of them are completely unrelated phylogenetically. So that means that this behavior developed somehow completely independently in several different animal groups. And then they have the same kinds of behaviors in terms of the social behaviors and the way that the colonies function. And then the other one I would cite is navigation, where a lot of different animals that are completely unrelated use similar kinds of navigation methods. And so there's, again, there's a question there about how could that have happened a number of times completely independently.
Okay, very, very interesting. Yeah, I mean, if it can evolve once, can it keep evolving? But then, this is not how common ancestry would expect us to see these things distributing among organisms where they're not shared by a common ancestor. So here's sort of a philosophical question for you, Eric. It's really an interesting one, but obviously you are treating animal behavior as algorithmic. And Tom is asking, I wonder whether our thinking of animals as algorithmic is a way of thinking that Descartes spoke of long ago. Does this thought process get rid of the possibility that animals have free will? What about human beings? So any thoughts on these big picture questions? If animals are just programmed, is there such a thing as free will in these animals?
Wow, that's a good question. What I would say is that in the types of animals that are discussed in the book, these animals are, they're not really that intelligent. In other words, they're not intelligent in the sense that we think of humans, other mammals, where we're able to think and have some form of free will. These animals, basically, all of their behaviors are programmed in one way or another. And whenever they are faced with a certain circumstance, they're going to behave in a pre-programmed type of way. Now, they do learn. Many of them do learn to some extent, but the basic behaviors there are really pre-programmed.
Yeah, I don't think anybody's going to get too worked up if it turns out that ants don't have free will, or it turns out that, a spider is just acting on instinct when it spins a web. On the other hand, those of us who've had like pet birds, I had a pet bird growing up. That bird it was very interactive. I mean, I had a friendship with this little pet parakeet when I was 8 years old. And so we'd like to think that some of these animals maybe do have some human-like ability to relate, free will, whatever you want to call it. I don't know. I mean, these are very complicated questions. We have a question from Jeff Simmons, who is a Discovery Institute fellow. And this is a question that actually I've wondered about for many years, Eric, because of my interest in paleomagnetism and the Earth's magnetic field, and also plate tectonics. And the question is, magnetic poles can shift. You know, we can have suddenly north become south and south becomes north. Continents can drift. And so can these animal behaviors accommodate changes in Earth's magnetic field or Earth's geography in order to allow animals to continue to migrate? So, and let me maybe put a little bit extra on this question. A geomagnetic reversal when the Earth's magnetic field flips is thought to occur potentially in less than 1,000 years. It might even be 500 years or less. We don't know for sure, but it could be a very short period of time. So can Darwinian evolution keep up with those kinds of shifts so that you don't have geese migrating north for the winter instead of south and then freezing to death, you know? Or is it possible that animals are actually pre-programmed to be able to adapt quickly to these magnetic reversals, which have happened many times throughout Earth's history? Any speculations or thoughts on this? Have you thought about this at all? Any thoughts you might have?
Yeah, that's one of the things that I've thought about a lot, is trying to figure out how could animals adapt to that. Like you say, that these pole reversals happen in a relatively short period of time. So a group of animals that migrate and depend on sensing the magnetic polarity, how do they adapt to that? I don't know. It's hard. So first thing would be, well, typical Darwinian evolution is too slow to adapt that quickly to something like that, you would think. So maybe there's some other mechanism, some kind of an epigenetic mechanism that's involved that allows an adaptation. We really don't know, but it's a great question.
Yeah, it is a really great question. I think you're right. I think that Darwinian evolution moves very slowly, and it's difficult to imagine it being able to keep up, because obviously if you get the migration wrong, you might not be able to survive. If you're migrating north for the winter, you're going to freeze to death. Or if you can't find that island out in the ocean where you want to go back and spawn and reproduce, you're not going to be able to leave offspring. So these are pretty important things. So I'm wondering, there's a question from Craig. Have you looked at all at the engineering basis for what systems are used by the hummingbird when it migrates with the seasons? And do you know anything about hummingbird migration and the integration of the systems in that organism?
No, sorry. I'm not that familiar with the hummingbird migrations.
Okay, that's fine. Robert asked the question, do you use the term instinct? He says, I never liked that term because it seemed like a placeholder for ignorance. So is instinct a real thing, or is an instinct just a programmed behavior? Are you maybe giving us a new paradigm for understanding what an instinct is as an algorithmic programmed behavior?
Well, that's an interesting question, because in researching the book, what I realized that within the scientific community, particularly the animal behaviorists, they had kind of moved away from the word instinct to describe behaviors such as this. They really don't like that term, but basically they've used other terms that are functionally equivalent, such as innate or pre-programmed. And it really, to me, you could use several different terms which really mean the same thing. That it's a behavior that does not require any learning. The animal exhibits the behavior almost from the moment it's born. And you can use whatever term you want to describe that, but previously people would have called that instinct.
Mm. So we have a question from Michaela, who says, do you see this becoming a growing field of research in the future? And I want to add to this a little bit. I help to direct the ID 3.0 research program here at Discovery Institute. And one of the exciting things, one of the points of the ID 3.0 research program is to see ID research breaking into new fields that it's never gone into before. Population genetics, biomedicine, therapies, all kinds of different new fields. So I think a field of animal behavior would be a wonderful field for ID to be able to break into. So do you see this becoming a field of ID research in the future? And if so, do you have any words of wisdom you could give people who are interested in animal behavior and want to try to apply ID to understanding animal behavior?
Yeah, exactly. That's what one of the things I'm hoping for that might come out of this is, because I've really just kind of scratched the surface. And it's basically just by reviewing the literature that's out there. There is a lot of research that has been done in a number of these types of behaviors, but obviously not from an ID perspective. And there's a lot of more research that could be done to try to assess and, determine where these behaviors come from, how they develop, what controls them. And in particular, another aspect of it that we kind of touched on a little bit is how do these behaviors actually get programmed into the brain in some way? There's an area of neuroscience here that is ripe for a lot of research. And so that's what I'm hoping that there'll be ideas for new research to get into.
Well, great. Well, I think that's a great place to end this webinar, Eric. Thank you so much, Eric Cassel, for your book, Animal Algorithms. I hope that it's inspiring to people who want to pursue ID research in this area of animal behavior. And I also want to mention that if you have bought the book, we would really appreciate it if you would go and review it on Amazon. It's always helpful to have people be able to hear your thoughts about these books, share your insights, share your inspiration from Eric Cassel. So Eric, thank you so much for the work you've done and for helping us to learn so much about animal algorithms and for opening up a new field, I think, of ID research here.
Thanks, Casey. I appreciate it. I really enjoyed this.
Okay. Well, thanks also for the participants who have come and engaged with us today. Some great questions and a great conversation. This was a lot of fun. I'm Casey Luskin, and please stay tuned. Hopefully, we'll do this again, another webinar on a new book in the not too distant future.